people are looking for what someone recently called in a conversation with me the white space in the marketplace, right? You know, the classic perceptual diagram that shows, you know, there's 2 or 3 competitors here and yours is always on the top right. Right. Well, I think those are worth making, by the way, to understand dimensions in the marketplace. However, I think that's a very rudimentary way of looking at market opportunity, right? And missing from that is certainly the value chain piece that we've talked about, right? I mean, so at a conference like this, right, everyone, at least my experience is always, everyone wants to tell you their idea, which is great, right? And when you've had the dubious honor of hearing just thousands of these ideas in the last year or so, right, you kind of have this switch that goes off in your head, and you have to like keep a straight face while you do it. And sometimes it's, oh man, I am really sorry that you're trying this. And that's a terrible thing to say for someone whose mission is to expand the pool of innovative entrepreneurs. Sometimes it's, well, actually that could be cool, but wait a minute, right? And then something is like, wow, you're really onto something. Let's talk about X, Y, and Z. You know, but to answer it, let me just say 3 things that I think are often elicit the first piece, the first response, which is 1, you've thought about the white space, but you haven't thought about the value chain. 2, that you've thought about technology and you haven't thought about business model. I mean, Clay Christensen has made this insight very well known. 3, that you've thought about your market without thinking about how to reach it, right? So one of the things, it's like the mind of the entrepreneur is a direct-to-consumer mind, which is great, right? But so one of the things that always sets off the warning light is when someone says, and we're going to use social media and create viral videos to release our customer. Now, my company was responsible for several videos that had, my digital agency, millions or hundreds of thousands of hits, depending on the video, right? That's not an accident. And it's certainly not something that happens by just putting it up on YouTube, right? And if you want, we can get into all kinds of detail about that. But one of my, so the concern there is that unless, as I like to say, you've invented the flux capacitor, and sometimes even if you have, right, which is the time travel technology for Back to the Future, which these days only 1 in 20 entrepreneurs has heard of. Unless you've done that, or unless you're very well connected, right? I don't know, Richard Branson is your uncle or something like that, and you can have now Virgin time travel, right? Or unless you get very lucky. I mean, there's a bunch of unlesses, right? But for the average innovator, you actually need to acquire customers. That typically involves dealing with market gatekeepers and channels to get them. And it also deals with what I call nodes, right? So you have an app. Well, one of the most powerful ways to get an app node is to be on New and Notable. How do you get on New and Notable? For iTunes, Apple likes you, right? It's not an automated thing. You want a viral spot that's funny? Get it on College Humor. At least when I was dealing with this stuff, that's the way it was. And there was actually, you could look this up. It was one of those places where it tended to launch to a broader audience. So, we all love the tipping point, and I think there's real insight there, but not all of us do. Some of us do. It's a very inspiring way of looking at things, but I do think that there's this importance to be realism about channels. A third area is, I tend to find these days that people are either super lean startup or super old school strategy. And obviously, we need to be somewhere in between, or at least we need to be thinking about both, right? The great thing about minimum viable products, and it really is a great thing, is that it teaches rapid prototyping and market validation. And, thanks to Eric Ries and Steve Blank and those guys that made that happen. But if we're not strategic, then I fear that we're just throwing products against the wall, right? We really do need to think about markets, and we really do need to think about changing industries if we want to do the kind of thing I was talking about on the part of somebody like Bezos, right? It's not that he didn't take extraordinary risks and try things out, right? Starting with books, music, and video, it's a really smart thing to do. But I think the big moment for Amazon was not that. It was when I was reading analyst reports from investment banks in about 2001, I think it was, and they were all saying, why is this guy building big warehouse liquidation centers, warehouse distribution centers, right? He'll never get them to capacity, they'll never pay for themselves, and stop trying to sell garden hoses. Stick with your sweet spot. The conventional MBA wisdom was you're going beyond core competency. But talking about, see, this is where it gets beyond even concepts like value chain to thinking, and I call it a user-based approach to marketing. I think if we're not taking that in today's age, we're nuts, right? And I think what he realized was that if he owned you as a customer, right? Now, think of all the strategic moves that have been done to achieve that. Selling Kindles at a loss, right? Why? Because people don't even read that much anymore. I read a statistic that people in a certain youth demographic make movies more often than they read. I don't know that that's a bad thing. I'm into reading, but making film's pretty cool too, right? My point here, though, is very simple, which is just that by taking these strategic moves, to take that big risk, to expand the market, what he figured out was, and you scratch an Amazon Prime customer, however much they might get criticized, that customer, they actually have this positive feeling about ordering something from Amazon, and they're actually not always looking where they could get it cheaper, right? You are, by definition, because of the way the affiliate programs are set up on Amazon, you are paying more than you need to for those products, and you know what? You're paying for it on purpose, right? And that's why Zappos was such a logical acquisition for them, actually, because they did the same, not the same thing, but in the sense that Tony Hsieh was able to see that people will pay for that. And look, in some sense, this is no different than the classic Michael Porter. You know, you're either going to buy it at a low price or you know, for some value add, right? Probably not putting it in the proper way here. It's been a long conference. But the key here, I think, in terms of those dangers, the pieces that are missed when thinking about change, I think is, if I had to pick one point, it would be to think about the user. And this, by the way, is like pulling teeth with entrepreneurs, because I give them that capture framework that I talked about with you yesterday, and I say, I don't even want to hear from you until you've actually talked to users, that's the you in capture, about how they're responding, right? And this is something I took from doing user experience development for a lot of clients. But if you're not thinking about how use is changing and how it could work, then I think you're missing that dangling value. You're missing the ways in which things could be used. We had an interesting, the other piece, though, is that business model piece that I kind of neglected and went through in passing. There was a panelist from Quirky, rather, yesterday. I'm confusing my KW apps. Yesterday, who talked about, he gave this video of a guy who developed a smart air conditioning unit, right, where you could turn it on and off from your smartphone. It's great. But what I wanted to ask him was, have they, this GE co-sponsored it with this inventor, and their model is to make it for the inventor, right? Mm-hmm. And what I want to ask him, and did ask him, is, have you thought about whether you could change the model to something like the cell phone model, right? Where, you know, many customers will pay 3 times on Sprint what they pay on Boost Mobile so that they can have a subsidized iPhone, and only in the initial cash flow. And that's so important to us. It's a bad source of, you know, consumer capital. I mean, you're probably paying way more than that 20% APR for that $600 phone when you pay $120 a month on your cell phone bill. So question is, can you think about the same thing? What if you were to reduce the cost of, so you give them the free air conditioner, and you make a deal with the utilities company that every dollar saved you get, right? You know, which if you think about it, it's like a little built-in derivative, right? But I think this is what Tesla should do. I think Tesla should figure out how much, because obviously the challenge is, you know, can we, when the externalities of using gasoline are still so significant, right? Mm-hmm. We don't really, in the United States, pay the real cost of gasoline for reasons we could get into. Why don't we shift to a model that uses fuel so much more efficiently, right? Well, partly it's that those things are still expensive, and they're expensive now because obviously they're going to need the volume and then they're going to need the infrastructure before it becomes, to telescope that process. I think we can take a page from finance, and there's models that do this. And I don't know if this is viable for Tesla. I haven't done the detailed research, but at least I want us to be asking the question, could they give you a Tesla that's the same cost as your Honda Civic? And then every time you pay gas, every time you go to pay gas, you're using a Tesla credit card, you pay at the pump, and the amount less than you would have paid, the difference between what you would have paid for gas and what you're paying at their electric pump goes back to Tesla, right? And what does that do? It allows the consumer to get in at a cost that seems non-prohibitive. And then the company gets to make money off of those flows afterwards.